For 25 centuries, one story about the Etruscans went almost completely unchallenged. Ancient writers insisted these people arrived in Italy from somewhere far away, refugees crossing the sea after some forgotten disaster struck their homeland in the east. Roman scholars repeated the same claim and folded it into the founding story of their own civilization. Schoolbooks printed it, museums displayed it. For most of recorded history, if you wanted to know where the Etruscans came from, every trusted source pointed east, toward Anatolia, toward a land across the Mediterranean, toward an origin story wrapped in myth and migration. Then, in 2021, a team of scientists did something that no historian with a pen and a stack of ancient scrolls could ever have done. They opened the bones themselves. They pulled ancient DNA out of skeletons that had been resting in Italian soil for thousands of years, and what that DNA revealed didn't just complicate the old story. It tore the foundation out from under it completely. The Etruscans were never outsiders. They never sailed in from a foreign shore. They were born from the same soil their descendants were later buried in. But the story of what happened to them after Rome swallowed their world is far stranger and far darker than any tale of wandering exiles ever was. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Almost everything passed down to us about where the Etruscans came from rests on a mistake. Not a deliberate deception, but an error so old, so repeated, and so deeply woven into the fabric of Western history that people simply stopped questioning it. The ancient authors we still quote today as authorities built their entire account on one central assumption, that the Etruscans arrived from elsewhere. They pictured a people stepping onto Italian shores as strangers, carrying with them a language nobody could easily place, customs that seemed foreign, and skills so advanced that later observers assumed they must have come from a more sophisticated world across the water. Herodotus, often called the father of history, claimed they fled Lydia and Anatolia after a famine so severe their king ordered half the population to leave and find a new home. Other writers of antiquity leaned into similar theories, some pointing toward Greek influence, others toward vague connections with the Eastern Mediterranean. Nobody had the tools to check any of it, so the story simply repeated itself for generation after generation, gathering the weight of tradition until it felt less like a theory and more like settled fact. And it did not stay confined to old scrolls. This assumption became structural. It shaped how entire civilizations understood themselves. Rome's own origin mythology absorbed pieces of it. Early Roman kings came from Etruscan bloodlines. The priests who read omens and interpreted the will of the gods for the Roman state followed a religious tradition believed to trace back to this supposedly foreign people. Generations of scholars taught this as history. Documentaries repeated it with confident narration and dramatic music. The idea that the Etruscans arrived from somewhere mysterious became so deeply embedded that almost nobody thought to ask the obvious question. What if the entire premise was wrong from the very beginning? What if ancient writers, working centuries after the fact, filled the gaps in their knowledge with guesswork dressed up as certainty? Because that is exactly what many of them were doing. Herodotus was writing about events he believed happened many generations before his own lifetime, relying on secondhand stories, travelers' rumors, and the kind of confident storytelling that ancient historians used to fill in blanks they could not actually verify. Then came 2021, and everything changed. An international team of researchers, spanning institutions across Germany, Italy, the United States, Denmark, and the United Kingdom, undertook a project that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. They extracted and sequenced the full genomes of 82 ancient individuals, men, women, and children, who had lived across central and southern Italy over nearly 2,000 years, stretching from roughly 800 BCE all the way to 1000 CE. They published their findings in one of the most rigorous scientific journals in the world, and the results did not simply nudge the old narrative. They obliterated it. Before we get to what the study actually found, it is worth pausing on just how radical this kind of project really was. Ancient DNA does not survive well. Heat, moisture, and thousands of years of decay destroy most of the genetic material locked inside old bone, which is why earlier generations of scientists assumed a study like this one was simply impossible on this scale. Advances in laboratory techniques over the past 2 decades changed that. Researchers learned how to target the dense petrous bone at the base of the skull, a part of the body that preserves DNA far better than almost anywhere else, and from there they could pull out usable genetic sequences, even from remains that had been buried for over 2,000 years. That technical leap is what finally made a study like this possible, and it is the same leap that has quietly rewritten population history all across the ancient world, not just in Italy. The Etruscans were not migrants from Anatolia. They were not refugees fleeing famine across the sea. They were not mysterious outsiders who showed up bearing gifts of advanced knowledge. They were local. Their genetic signature traced directly back to the same population layers found across the rest of Iron Age Italy. And remarkably, they were nearly indistinguishable from the Latin peoples living just a short distance to the south, in the region that would eventually become Rome. Stop and consider what that actually means. Every ancient account claiming the Etruscans crossed the sea from the east was flatly incorrect, not partially mistaken, not open to interpretation, simply measurably, genetically wrong. The researchers searched for any trace of recent Anatolian ancestry in the Etruscan samples and found essentially none. If a substantial wave of migrants had truly arrived from Lydia around 1200 BCE, as Herodotus claimed, that migration would have left an unmistakable genetic fingerprint. It would show up clearly against the background population, the way a foreign ingredient stands out in an otherwise consistent mixture. Instead, the data revealed something else entirely. Etruscan ancestry traced back to the same 3 deep population layers that define Iron Age Italy as a whole. They carried genetic contributions from Neolithic farmers who had arrived from Anatolia thousands of years earlier, so long before that those older migrations had already fully blended into the local population by the time Etruscan culture took shape. They carried genetic markers from Bronze Age herding peoples who had swept across Europe from the steppes during the great Indo-European expansion. And they carried the deep ancestry of hunter-gatherers who had lived on the Italian peninsula since the retreat of the last ice age. In short, the Etruscans were simply Italian, fully, completely, and without ambiguity. But that conclusion opens up a puzzle that mainstream Etruscan scholarship had never satisfactorily solved. If the Etruscans were truly native to Italy, if there was no dramatic wave of outside settlers, then how did they hold onto a language so radically different from everyone around them? Etruscan is famously non-Indo-European, an outlier that linguists have never fully deciphered even after more than a century of study. So how did a language like that manage to survive and thrive in a region gradually filling up with Indo-European speakers throughout the Bronze Age? The genetic evidence now points toward a long, gradual process of blending and cultural absorption, one that may have stretched across many generations, in which early Indo-European speaking groups were slowly folded into a pre-existing Etruscan speaking community rather than the other way around. Picture what that scenario actually implies. Through the 2nd millennium BCE, Indo-European peoples were pouring into the Italian peninsula from the Eurasian steppes, bringing their languages, their genetic heritage, and their customs with them. The Bronze Age was a period of sweeping transformation across the entire European continent. And yet, against that backdrop, the Etruscan language held on. It did not fade away. It did not dissolve into Latin. It remained a living, spoken language deep into the era of the Roman Republic, right up until Rome finally absorbed Etruscan territory and Latin displaced it for good. That kind of persistence is telling. It suggests a community with such strong internal cohesion, such a firm sense of identity, and such social stability that it could keep its language alive, even while absorbing genetic material, and very likely cultural material, from the very Indo-European groups arriving around them. That is not the behavior of a population that had recently landed as strangers. That is the behavior of an established society defending what made it distinct, even while adapting to survive. Linguists have wrestled with Etruscan for well over 100 years, and the language still resists easy classification. We can read the Etruscan alphabet, since it borrows heavily from Greek letters, but reading the letters is not the same as understanding the meaning behind them. Most surviving Etruscan texts are short funerary inscriptions, names, titles, and formulaic phrases repeated on tombs, which gives us just enough to sketch an outline of the grammar without ever fully reconstructing the spoken language in its living form. That mismatch between an alphabet we can read and a language we still cannot fully translate has fueled speculation for generations. Some scholars pointed to that mystery as evidence of foreign origin, reasoning that a truly local language should have left more obvious connections to its neighbors. The genetic findings flipped that assumption on its head. Etruscan was not foreign because Etruscan people were foreign. It was simply an old survivor, a language that had likely been spoken on the Italian peninsula since long before Indo-European speech ever arrived, holding on stubbornly while the linguistic map around it was completely redrawn. And this is the point where the story takes a much darker turn, because the genetic record shows something that completely reshapes how we should understand Etruscan history as a whole. For roughly 800 years, spanning the entire Iron Age and continuing into the early stages of Roman expansion, the Etruscan gene pool stayed remarkably stable and consistent. There were occasional individuals with outside ancestry from Central Europe, North Africa, or the Near East, but these were exceptions rather than trends, isolated cases scattered across an otherwise steady, self-contained population. That consistency is almost startling when you consider the scale of it. 8 centuries of genetic continuity, 800 years, during which a recognizable population held onto its identity and its biological makeup, even as the entire political landscape of the Italian peninsula transformed around it. Rome was climbing toward power. Greek colonies flourished in the south. Trade routes stretched further and further across the Mediterranean. Empires clashed and rearranged the map again and again, and through all of it, the core genetic identity of the Etruscan people barely shifted at all. Then came the turning point, the moment when this slow, steady story of continuity snapped into something sudden and violent. When Rome stopped being a regional Italian power and became a sprawling Mediterranean empire, everything changed, and it changed fast. During the imperial period, beginning around 27 BCE with the rise of Augustus and continuing for centuries afterward, the genetic landscape of central Italy underwent a transformation so large and so rapid that it is hard to describe using the careful, measured language scientists usually reach for. Roughly half of the ancestry found in central Italian populations shifted. Not gradually across generations of slow mixing, but in what researchers themselves describe as an abrupt population-wide change. That word choice matters. Abrupt, not gradual, not slow, abrupt. What does a shift of that magnitude actually mean in human terms? It means that by the time the Roman Empire had fully matured, the descendants of the old Etruscan population had become genetically distinct from their own Iron Age ancestors. Roughly half of their ancestry now traced back to the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the lead scientists behind this research explained in interviews that this genetic shift was, to a significant extent, driven by enslaved people, but also by soldiers and merchants moving through the growing empire. Read that carefully, because it says something important. Rome was not simply conquering Etruscan territory and administering it from a distance. Rome was moving human beings, entire populations pulled from across the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Levant, from Egypt, from Syria, from North Africa, and relocating them into central Italy. Enslaved people were forced to work the massive agricultural estates that Rome's wealthy elite built on the profits of conquest. Military units drawn from border provinces and eastern territories were stationed across the Italian peninsula to keep order. Merchants and traders moved constantly along expanding trade networks that connected Rome to every corner of its growing empire. And when these newly arrived populations mixed with the descendants of the old Etruscan people, whether through marriage, cohabitation, or far more coercive circumstances, they left a genetic imprint so strong that it reshaped the biological makeup of central Italy within just a handful of generations. Think about what this means for Etruscan identity as a whole. For 800 years, this population held onto its genetic and cultural continuity despite enormous political pressure surrounding them on every side. Their language survived, even as Latin steadily gained ground. Their religious traditions shaped Roman belief systems in lasting ways. Their artistic style influenced both Greek and Roman aesthetics for centuries. And then, within only a few generations at the start of the imperial era, their biological composition was fundamentally rewritten. People living in the same towns, farming the same land, and carrying forward the same cultural traditions as their Iron Age ancestors were, by roughly the 1st century of the Common Era, genetically a different population altogether. They were no longer the same people who had lived there 800 years earlier. Rome did not simply conquer the Etruscans politically and militarily, Rome dissolved them biologically. This was not genocide in the way we typically use that word. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more total. A slow demographic replacement carried out through the systematic movement of foreign populations into conquered land, generation after generation, until the old biological identity simply stopped existing as a distinct thing. It helps to remember just how large the Roman economy of forced human movement actually was. Historians estimate that by the height of the empire, enslaved people made up a substantial share of the population living on the Italian peninsula, and a great many of them had been captured or purchased from territories bordering the eastern Mediterranean. This was not a side effect of empire. It was one of the engines that powered it. Wars of conquest produced captives. Captives became laborers on estates, in mines and households, and increasingly in the very towns that had once been the heart of Etruscan civilization. Add to that the steady rotation of soldiers drawn from provinces across the empire, many of them settling permanently in Italy after their service ended, and the scale of the population movement becomes easier to picture. This was not a handful of newcomers quietly blending in over centuries. It was a sustained, structural feature of how the Roman state operated, and the genetic record simply confirms in cold, measurable terms what economic historians had already suspected, from tax records, shipping manifests, and burial inscriptions. The medieval period that followed brought yet another layer of genetic change. Northern European ancestry, largely Germanic in origin, appeared across central Italy during the early medieval centuries as Roman administrative control collapsed and Germanic peoples moved into former Roman territory. By the time modern genetic testing maps the ancestry of people living in central Italy today, that genetic landscape reflects wave after wave of migration and mixing. Ancient hunter-gatherers and early farmers, Bronze Age steppe peoples, the massive Roman imperial influx from the eastern Mediterranean, medieval Germanic settlers, and countless smaller contributions from traders, colonists, and conquerors across the centuries that followed. The Etruscans, as a distinct and identifiable genetic population, simply ceased to exist. Not suddenly, not in a single catastrophic event, but definitively and completely all the same. Their biological identity was absorbed, transformed, and ultimately erased through demographic processes that Rome itself had set into motion centuries earlier. But here is the part of this story that lingers, the part that feels genuinely unsettling once you sit with it. Even though the Etruscans left no clear, direct genetic trace in the people who live in that region today, something of their culture survived anyway, carried forward by the very civilization that conquered and effectively erased them biologically. The Romans absorbed Etruscan religious customs wholesale. Roman priests learned to read omens and interpret the will of the gods using divination techniques borrowed directly from Etruscan tradition. The bundle of rods that later became a symbol of Roman state authority, carried by officials as a mark of power, originated in Etruscan culture. Even the toga, that unmistakable symbol of Roman citizenship, developed out of earlier Etruscan clothing styles. In a strange twist of history, the Romans became the cultural inheritors of the very civilization they were simultaneously wiping out on a biological level. This creates a genuine paradox, one that historians are still trying to fully make sense of. How can a people continue to shape culture long after their biological identity has effectively disappeared? How can descendants of a population that absorbed and replaced the Etruscans still carry forward distinctly Etruscan cultural elements when those descendants are, genetically speaking, no longer primarily Etruscan at all? The answer lies in a simple but important distinction that cultural transmission and genetic inheritance operate on completely separate tracks. You can teach a child your language, your religious beliefs, and your artistic traditions, regardless of how much your community's genetic makeup has shifted through mixing with outside populations. Culture can survive genetic replacement because culture exists on an entirely different level than biology does. The people who lived in the old Etruscan heartland during and after the Roman imperial period inherited Etruscan cultural practices even as their own genetic ancestry increasingly traced back to the Eastern Mediterranean, and later to Germanic Europe. The region itself maintained a kind of continuity, even as the Etruscans, understood as a distinct biological population, quietly disappeared from the genetic record altogether. And the research reveals something further still about how populations stabilize after periods of dramatic upheaval. Once this massive Roman-era genetic shift had run its course, the gene pool of central Italy settled back into a new kind of stability. Populations across the region from the early medieval period right up through today show clear continuity with the post-imperial genetic composition. This suggests that the genetic foundation of modern Central Italians was largely locked into place somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. The dramatic upheavals happened during very specific historical windows, with the Roman imperial period standing out as by far the most extreme. But once that new composition had settled, it remained relatively stable across the centuries that followed. People living in these regions today carry a genetic inheritance woven together from Bronze Age locals, Mediterranean traders, Roman soldiers, Germanic settlers, and countless other groups whose individual identities have long since been lost to history. What makes this particular study so scientifically remarkable is the sheer time depth it covers. Researchers analyzed individuals spanning nearly 2,000 years, which meant they could track genetic change not across mere decades or even single centuries, but across the entire sweep of classical antiquity and well into the medieval period. That kind of extended timeline allowed patterns to emerge that would have been completely invisible in any shorter study. They could clearly see the long, steady stability of the Iron Age, the sudden and dramatic disruption of the imperial period, and the eventual settling into a new genetic profile during the medieval centuries that followed. None of this rests on speculation or guesswork. It comes directly from ancient genetic material recovered from human remains, analyzed with modern molecular tools, and interpreted using statistical methods capable of distinguishing between ordinary background variation and genuinely significant population-wide shifts. The implications reach well beyond ancient Italian history. This research demonstrates in very concrete terms how genetic evidence can definitively overturn historical narratives that have stood essentially unchallenged for thousands of years. It shows that leaning too heavily on classical written sources, however valuable they remain for many other purposes, can lead us seriously astray on questions involving human origins and population movement. The ancient writers were not lying to us. They were simply mistaken, working with limited geographic knowledge and cultural assumptions that pushed them toward the wrong conclusions about where the Etruscans actually came from. And yet we treated their accounts as authoritative for 2,000 years, largely because they were the only accounts available. Now there is a new kind of source altogether, the genetic record itself, written into DNA, preserved quietly in bone for thousands of years, and finally readable thanks to the tools of modern science. So the real story of the Etruscans is not one about mysterious foreigners arriving on Italian shores with some advanced civilization already fully formed. It is the story of a native population that developed its own distinctive culture, held onto a unique linguistic identity despite centuries of Indo-European pressure pushing in from every direction, and was later genetically transformed by demographic forces that Roman imperial expansion set loose across the ancient world. It is a story of cultural persistence unfolding at the exact same time as biological replacement. Two very different kinds of survival and disappearance happening simultaneously within the same population. It is also a reminder that the labels historians use to describe ancient peoples, Etruscan, Latin, Roman, do not necessarily map cleanly onto biological reality at all. An Etruscan living in the 3rd century of the Common Era might have been genetically half Eastern Mediterranean and half local Italian, while still practicing distinctly Etruscan religious rites, and living on land that had been considered Etruscan territory for as long as anyone could remember. Identity, it turns out, is genuinely complicated. Genetics offers precision, but not the full picture. History is always messier than any single explanatory framework can fully capture, no matter how elegant the framework might seem on paper. And that brings us to a question this research cannot quite fully answer, even with all its precision and depth. If the Etruscans really were genetically Italian all along, if there was no dramatic population replacement behind their origins, then how exactly did a non-Indo-European language manage to establish itself so firmly in a region experiencing such heavy Indo-European settlement over so many centuries? The genetic data confirms that it happened, but it does not fully explain the mechanism behind it. That part of the story, pieced together from archaeology, linguistics, and genetics working in combination, remains only partially resolved. And maybe that is fitting for a civilization that has puzzled scholars for 25 centuries and counting. This research also raises some genuinely uncomfortable questions about how we think about ethnic and national identity in the modern world. We tend to speak about peoples as though they are fixed biological categories, with an unbroken thread of heritage stretching backward through time. The Etruscans complicate that assumption in a very direct way. A modern person living in what was once Etruscan territory has inherited certain cultural traditions through the region's long continuity, and yet carries very little direct Etruscan biological ancestry in any strict genetic sense. Does that make them somehow less connected to Etruscan heritage than someone living far away who happens to carry a slightly higher proportion of Iron Age Italian ancestry purely through the randomness of genetic inheritance? Questions like that can feel abstract until you realize similar situations exist all over the world, places where cultural identity, genetic ancestry, territorial continuity, and historical narrative simply do not line up neatly with one another. The Etruscans show us, in an unusually clear and well-documented way, that civilizations can pass on their cultural essence long after their biological identity has been fundamentally transformed or even erased. That is a striking lesson about what it actually means to inherit a language, a culture, and a sense of place. What stands out most about this genetic evidence is how it manages to undercut the foundations of classical historical writing, while still, at the same time, confirming its partial value. The classical sources were wrong about where the Etruscans came from, but they were right about their cultural sophistication, their unusual language, and their genuine influence on how a Roman civilization developed. The error was geographic, a simple misidentification of origins built on incomplete information. But the observation of Etruscan cultural distinctiveness itself was accurate all along. That suggests we need genetics and written history working together, not in competition, to build a fuller and more honest picture of the past. Genetics alone cannot explain cultural change. Written history alone cannot verify large-scale population movement. Combined, they produce something richer, more complete, and ultimately far more truthful about how civilizations actually change, adapt, and persist across long stretches of time. The Etruscan case also says something uncomfortable about the nature of historical authority itself. For 2,000 years, people believed what ancient writers told them because there was simply no alternative available. Nobody could challenge Herodotus or later Roman historians directly because nobody had the tools to check their claims against physical evidence. The fact that modern genetic science can now definitively disprove some of their central assertions should make us genuinely humble about the limits of historical authority, about the risks of placing too much blind trust in old texts, and about the real possibility that other historical narratives we currently treat as settled fact might be just as vulnerable to future evidence overturning them completely. How many other foundational stories in Western history are resting on similarly shaky ground right now, preserved only because nobody has yet sequenced the right bones or asked the right questions in the right way? The mystery surrounding the Etruscans persisted for so long, not because it was truly unsolvable, but because, for most of history, we simply lacked the scientific methods needed to solve it. And when the solution finally arrived, it did not reveal some exotic tale of distant origins after all. It revealed something quieter, something local, something in many ways stranger and more instructive about power, identity, and the fragility of even the most established civilizations. than any migration story ever could have been.